I never really liked staying home alone, unlike a lot of other kids that I grew up with. Particularly around the time I was in middle school, I was a very paranoid person, and I typically didn't like anything scary. I wasn't a fan of scary movies, and I didn't like going to haunted houses. That changed as I got older, but when I was a kid, I was scared very easily. Though there is this one time that it turned out I had a right to be afraid of any little noise. I was in middle school at the time, and my mom had recently started seeing this guy, Rick. He was pretty cool, and my mom seemed to like him. Plus, it got her out of the house every once in a while. And one night, it was the Friday before the weekend, she came up to me and asked if I would mind if she and Rick went to see a movie. It was going to be dark soon, and she knew that I didn't like being home alone at night. But seeing how happy Rick made her, I told her to go for it. And when she left, I just locked the door behind her and did my best to keep myself entertained. It must have only been about 20 minutes after she left that the rain started pouring down. At first, I didn't even notice it, but before long, all I could hear other than the TV was the sound of the heavy droplets crashing down onto the roof above me. It was at that point that I decided to go and turn on some lights so I wasn't alone in a dark house. However, when I began making my way out of the living room and into the kitchen, I heard something strange. It was almost like something was scratching the door leading from the kitchen to the outside. I stopped and listened really closely to see if I would hear it again, and sure enough, I heard a scratching sound. Even though I was scared half to death, in my head, I thought it must have been my neighbor's dog or something, so I went to go see what was making the noise. Before opening the door, I looked out the window, and before I could even get my head up to the glass, I heard a noise that sent chills through my entire body. Even though I couldn't see anything, I swear that I heard the sound of footsteps walking down off my front porch. I stepped away from the door and looked down at the lock to make sure that it was still engaged, and I immediately began making my way out of the kitchen. I tried to put the noise that I heard out of my head, but for some reason, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I swear I could hear the scratching noise, even over the sound of the rain. It was like it was still happening. But that was when I realized I wasn't hearing it from the kitchen anymore. Instead, that same exact scraping or scratching noise sounded like it was coming from the window in my mom's bedroom. However, just as I noticed the sound, it stopped. I turned the living room TV down, and I could feel my heart racing as I listened closely. What I heard next sent me crawling across the floor into my bedroom, where I hid under my bed. As I listened for the sound of anything other than the sound of raindrops, I heard the sound of something scratching at the window behind me. My eyes widened and I fell to the ground out of sight from the window. The scratching noise stopped as I hit the ground, making a loud thump. I quickly crawled into my bedroom where I felt safe and made my way under the bed where I thought I would be able to hide in case anyone got inside. Thankfully, it never came to that. After a little while of me hiding under my bed, I ended up getting the courage to make a run for the house phone, and I called my neighbor. She came to pick me up, and I spent the next 2 hours at her house while I waited for my mom to get home. After I told my mom what happened, she and Rick walked around the house looking for any sign that there was someone outside of the house that night, and to their surprise, they ended up finding jagged-looking scratch marks near the cracks between the window and windowsills. Rick even thought he could make out what looked like footprints that had been left behind in the mud. The whole thing not only terrified me, but it clearly made Rick and my mom uneasy, because it wasn't too long after that when we ended up having multiple cameras installed around our house, just in case whoever it was had chosen to come back. From the years of 2010 through 2017, I worked as a doorman outside of a 5-star hotel in New York City. It wasn't a glorified job, but I really enjoyed it. I got to know a lot of my coworkers really well, and for the time that I worked the overnight shift, it was a really easy job. For the most part, my shift simply consisted of me standing outside of the hotel, opening and closing the door for anyone who was coming or going. And as the night drags on, the number of times I have to do that gets lower and lower. There are a few crazy stories that you get from working as a doorman though. Most are wild and hilarious, but some will give you chills right down to your core. One of the scariest incidents I have ever been in happened while I was working overnight back in 2014. I remember that it was raining pretty hard that night, so my boss actually let me stand inside the building as long as I was paying attention enough to open the door for anyone coming off the street. I remember staring out through the glass door at the raindrops hitting the street and the street light reflecting off the puddles that formed near the sidewalk. And the few times I had to open the door for our patrons were actually refreshing because each time I would get hit with a nice gust of cool air. Things changed, however, as the night went on, and by the time it was 1 in the morning, I had started to grow bored. We hadn't had anyone come in or leave in nearly 2 hours, and there was only so much I could do while simply standing there. That was when I noticed 2 people walking down the sidewalk, and I thought that they might be heading to the hotel. So I opened the door and stepped outside. I wished the 2 men good evening and nodded my head to greet them, but it turned out they weren't coming into the hotel. Instead, one of them looked over to me, and from under his hood he said, "Mind your business." I tried not to take any offense from this, and figured that it was just your typical New Yorker. But as I stepped back into the hotel, I turned to close the door behind me. I saw something weird. The 2 men began walking down the alley behind the hotel instead of continuing down the sidewalk. Now, I tried to mind my own business, so I didn't pay any attention. But when I couldn't simply ignore what I heard a few moments later, as I was staring out the door to the hotel waiting for any guest to come by, I heard the unmistakable sound of a gunshot. This was followed by one of the men running out of the alleyway and back down the sidewalk past the hotel. I'm not sure what compelled me to do this, but I knew something was wrong. So I opened the door and yelled at the man that was running away. But as I got his attention, I could see that he was carrying a gun in his hand. He stopped in his tracks and turned to look at me. The man began walking back toward the hotel and lifted his gun, which was when I ran back into the hotel and locked the door behind me before telling everyone inside to get down and hide. I made it to the phone and called the police, but by the time they got there, the man with the gun was gone. The other man that I had seen him walking with wasn't as lucky though. The police found him in the alley with a single bullet wound to his head. They rushed him to the hospital, and he ended up making a full recovery. According to the victim, he had met the shooter that night at a club, and the pair were supposed to go back to his apartment before he was robbed. Have you ever been pretty sure that your eyes were just playing tricks on you, but some part of you, deep down, really believes you saw what you thought you were seeing? That happened to me when I was spending a week of my summer break at my college roommate's family's cabin. It was a really nice cabin in the middle of the woods with almost nothing around but nature. The 2 of us and his family were having a blast, even during the 2 rainy days that we had. The first day we spent playing Monopoly and a bit of Pictionary, which was a ton of fun, but that night was something that still freaks me out when I think about it. After my friend Rocky and his family went to bed, I couldn't help but stay up. I always had a hard time getting to sleep, ever since I was a little kid, and because when you're in college you tend to have bad habits, I decided to go out on the front porch and have a smoke. I quietly made my way outside, so I didn't wake anyone up, and I just stared out into the dark, rain-soaked forest as I began smoking my cigarette. I made it about halfway through the smoke before I noticed something strange out in the distance. It was hard to see because of the lack of moonlight thanks to the clouds, but for a second, I thought I saw a person. I shook my head and told myself that I was being crazy. There was no way that there was anyone out there in the middle of the woods with us. But as I focused back on the spot, I ended up sitting up straight as I looked onto the silhouette of a figure that I was almost certain was another person. I stared at the shadowy figure for a moment before looking down so that I could put out my cigarette, and by the time I looked back up, the silhouette was gone. I looked around for a second trying to see if there was anything else strange around, but when I didn't see anything, I quickly brushed it off as my imagination and went back inside. I was able to fall asleep a few hours later, but when I woke up the next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure that I thought I imagined standing in the rain. It was so strange. That usually never happened to me. So I got out of bed and met Rocky in the kitchen where we were getting ready to have some breakfast. That was when Rocky's dad said something that really surprised me. As I was sitting down, he said, "You know you could have smoked your cigarette on the porch, right? That way you didn't have to get all wet." That confused me because that's exactly where I smoked last night, which was what I told him and asked him what he meant. That was when he informed me and Rocky that when he got up to use the bathroom last night, he looked out the window and could have sworn that he saw someone standing out in front of the cabin in the middle of the trail. That was also when he let us know that when he woke up there was a trail of water inside the front of the cabin, as if someone had come in from the rain. I immediately let him know that it didn't come from me, and we knew that we had to get everyone together quickly because it was looking like someone had broken into the cabin last night while we were all sleeping. Rocky's mom and little sister came into the kitchen and we all hung out there while we waited for the police to arrive. Once they got there, his dad and I told them both our stories, and the officers immediately began doing a walkthrough of the house. And sure enough, hiding in the front hallway closet was a dangerously thin, elderly man who had fallen asleep in a ball on the floor with a puddle of water around him. The police woke the man up and he seemed almost shocked to be there. But once the police explained who he was, it all became clear. Apparently, they would run into the man a lot. He was a heavy drug user and was in and out of jail on a regular basis because he would often get too high, wander around, and then wake up in random strangers' homes. Rocky's parents had him arrested, and I think we all had a hard time sleeping the rest of the time that we were at the cabin.